Hey, it's Jesse with Open States, and this video is an introduction to the API that allows you to access our data in a structured format. And we'll also go through some of the basics of how to get an API key, how to look through the documentation, and take a look at a couple example queries to the API so you get a feel for how to interact with it in real terms. All right, we're starting at docs.openstates.org, which has a page on our API v3 overview. We're just going to look at the v3 since that's our current API version. And you can see here we've got some basics, links to more detailed docs, quick overview of the methods. Now, this is a good starting point. If you forget anything from this video, just go back to this page and it'll be a good pointer for you. Before we dive into the details of the docs and the API, I want to make a quick pitch for our other data offerings. Depending on your use case, the API might not be the best first place to go to get data. If you're looking to do operations on a bunch of data, for example, you want to do an analysis of, thousands and thousands of bills across all the jurisdictions that we have, the bulk data actually might be a better place to start. So a quick pitch to take a look at the bulk data to see if that might be a better fit. And in that bulk data, you're going to see legislator data, data about people, elected officials in our data set. You're going to find bill and vote data. You can get Postgres data dumps. So for most popular categories of data, you can get bulk data that is going to be better suited to cases where you've got to work with a lot of data at once. It might just be a lot of work to write the code that iteratively pulls all that same data through the API. So quick pitch for our bulk data. Take a look at that if you're not sure if the API might be a good fit for you. Okay, so back to the API. It is a good fit if you want to quickly interact and query some of the data, or if you've got a use case where you just want to kind of selectively pick here and there. You don't want to have to parse through a bunch of bulk data. And it's pretty easy to get started with. First thing you're going to need to do is get an API key, which is, it states here, you need to go to openstates.org, click the sign up link, and sign up for an account in order to get an API key. So we're going to have to grab a email and password as normal. I'm going to delete this account later, so don't worry about seeing this stuff on the video. Agree I'm not a robot, sign up. And I'm able to see my account right away, but notice that we don't have an API key yet. We've got to verify our email, which I'm going to do on a different monitor just to keep this a little cleaner. Awesome. So let's come back here and refresh. I have clicked through my email. I have verified my email. I'm going to enable an API key. Awesome. So now I've got an API key. Let's copy that, put that somewhere. Great. So what do we do with our API key? There is a really quick way to look at the API and try it out, and that's right through our detailed documentation. So notice this link here, v3.openstates.org/docs, which is Open API or Swagger, if you've been around for a little longer, format of documentation for the API. And you actually have the opportunity to dive in here and just try that out. So I'm just going to look at the jurisdictions list endpoint. Let's click try it out. That makes all of this interactive. I'm going to take my API key, put it in here. Let's hit execute. Great, so we've got a real response from the server. Nice thing about this little Swagger auto-generated app is that we can immediately interact with the API, get a feel for what these endpoints return without having to write any curl commands or get into our API client, although I'll show an example of that a little bit later. One thing you'll note about the jurisdictions list here in our response, this is pretty common for our responses that they're going to be wrapped in this results array. And kind of by default, you're not going to get any filtering. So we're getting both municipalities, a lot of municipalities, probably not even going to see any states. Oh, there's one state at the very bottom here. So you can see this classification field determines whether it's a city or a state. And let's change that real quick. Let's go just to states. Execute that. And now we're just getting US states and territories back from the API. Awesome. So this documentation is pretty detailed. You can use that little trick once you've got an API key to use this page to interact with the API. There's going to be details about parameters, what an example response might be. There's also schemas explaining some details about our data at the very bottom. So this is this detailed documentation is a great place to explore the API further. But what if I don't want to use this? What if I want to get into a more serious tool to interact with the API? Let's take a look at importing this schema, schema for the API into Postman, which is a pretty popular API client, which looks roughly like this. Not sure how out of date my version is. It's been a little while since I've updated it probably. Nice thing we can do here is actually just import all of these API endpoints into Postman by copying this address, which is b3.openstates.org/openapi.json. We can do that using the import button in Postman. I go to link, paste that URL in there, continue. It's going to import into a new collection. That's fine. If I had a Postman account and I was logged in, it would do something different. I'm just going to take this simple route here. And look at that. So we've got under jurisdictions, that same jurisdiction list endpoint that we looked at through the web documentation is right here in Postman, where I can work with it. Very cool. But there's a couple setup things we want to do to make this a little bit easier for us to work with. So let me create a new environment. Environments are a place to kind of hold variables in Postman. And we're going to need to set a couple. Base URL, we are going to set to https b3.openstates.org. And we are going to set one called API key. Let's grab that API key again and put that in there. All right, we add that environment. Let's go to the OpenStates environment, make sure that environment is selected. And one thing that's going to do for us is there's in these endpoints that we got imported, there's already a variable you can see here called base URL. That's why we needed to set it to make sure that there is a value that points each of these templates to the right location when we make these requests. I also added API key because we're going to need to change our defaults here. There's sort of this placeholder default everywhere. But under headers, there's a header that sends that API key to us, to the server. So let's add API key as a variable there. That way, when I send the request, it's going to go to the right place. It's going to use my API key, and everything is going to be good. Now, you're going to see with a lot of these imported ones, again, there's kind of default values. Let's start by just disabling ones that we don't care about and try to make a request. Awesome. So we got the same thing. First off, we got all of the municipalities. Let's add that classification filter. We're going to use the same value that we saw in the docs. And now we've got US states coming back. Awesome. So that's really quick. 2 ways to get into the API and start interacting with it. Let's take a use case here and look at how we might, a somewhat real world way that we might kind of look through these API endpoints to give you some flavor of what you can find in here. And we'll end with some of the concepts, summing up some of the concepts that we found. So first off, let's say we just want to get bills just in the current legislative session in one state. So typically we want to start with an understanding of the jurisdiction that we care about. I'm going to pick North Dakota just because of the point of time when I recorded this video. They have a good number of bills in a new session. So I'm just looking through the results here, looking for North Dakota. There we go. So what we're seeing here on this page is the full name of the jurisdiction. That can be used by some of the endpoints to refer to the jurisdiction. We also have the ID for that jurisdiction. That also could be used to uniquely identify that jurisdiction. We've got a URL source for it, some metadata, the classification. Great. Let's look at a little more detail. So I'm going to go to the jurisdiction detail endpoint. Note that what we've got in here is a placeholder, this colon jurisdiction ID. And we're going to go ahead and replace that with the abbreviation for North Dakota, which is ND here in the US. We don't need this API key. We do need to change the header. So let's change this and get our API key variable in there. Great. So we're going to get the details for North Dakota. And you see we're getting the same stuff here. So one important concept to know about is the idea of includes. If we go back to the documentation, we're going to see some of this. Let's go down the jurisdiction detail. If you make a request and you don't get all that you're hoping for, check the includes because by default we're giving you quick data that's easy to skim through. But there are other includes that you could potentially add on there. So here we've got one called legislative sessions. What I'm looking to do is find out what are the legislative sessions for which we have data in North Dakota. I'm going to add a new param here. I'm going to call it include and use that same string that we saw on the docs, legislative underscore sessions. Again, that's here in this list, legislative sessions, paste it in, and let's send again. Awesome. Now we've got North Dakota back, but with more data. So we've got a new property, legislative sessions, and you can see it's an array of objects representing each of those sessions. Let's grab the most recent one. Each legislative session has an identifier. Again, that's a way to uniquely identify that session within the jurisdiction. These are not unique globally. These are unique within the jurisdiction because sometimes jurisdictions have similar identifiers. So I'm going to grab that. And now that I know the jurisdiction and the legislative session that I'm looking for, I can achieve my goal of finding bills in that legislative session. So I'm going to go under bills. I'm going to go to bills search endpoint. And you're going to see in here, there's quite a lot of potential parameters. We're not going to use most of these to start with. So I'm going to go ahead and disable a bunch of them. I'm going to leave the page and per page because that's a sane default. I'm going to go into headers and do the same thing I did before and put in my API key variable from my environment. Okay, now let's go back to the top. And here we're going to use the full name of the jurisdiction that we saw from that other endpoint. And we're going to use the session identifier that we saw as well, which was 68. Okay, let's see if this works. Great, we've got bills coming back. So again, wrapped in this object, the object of the parameter results, which is an array of the results that we got back. And we're starting to see different bills. You can see the title property for each of these bills. And at the very bottom, note that we got another property here that shows up on that object that comes back from the API, and that's pagination. That gives us information about how much of the total data set that we're seeing. And this is common to a lot of endpoints. Right now, we're seeing just 10 results per page. We're on page 1. Then we can see the number of the last page in the data set if we want to skip to that. And we also see the total number of items. So there are 338 bills available in this session in North Dakota. As I've said before, includes are your friend. So let me go back to, let's go to parameters. Let's add a new one. Let's say we've looked at this data and we would decide we want to look at sponsors. Let's find out bills that are sponsored by a certain person. So I can add include again. Let's say I also want actions. Include is an array, so I can add this multiply as a parameter. Let's add both of those, hit send again. And now we're going to get some extra properties on these bill objects. So sponsorships is an array. Let's collapse that. Actions is another array. Actions are the history of official actions taken on these bills. Got an introduction. We got a committee hearing on this one. But it also gets a little bit cumbersome to scroll through and skim, which is why they're not included by default. Let's look at sponsorships. Notice that this was introduced by, or one of the, let's just take one of these sponsors. I'm not even going to care who's the primary or not. Let's just say we want to look at all bills sponsored by Mark Weber here. One thing we can do is grab the ID. Each person is represented by a unique ID. Go back to our parameter list. And let's look for one of those parameters I disabled. So sponsor can be a name or an ID. So let's add that person ID, hit send. And notice now we've only got 10 items back. So we just got the bills that happen to be sponsored by that person. All right, so we've looked at one use case to look at bills by a certain sponsor. You've seen some of the concepts that come into play here, but I'm just going to summarize some of these API concepts. So once again, at the top level, you've got documentation. At a very quick version is in the docs.openstates.org. The detailed docs are linked there, which is this Open API specification. This is your best source for looking at documentation about the endpoints, the details of parameters, of responses, what the API is expecting. And I also want to note some of the important inputs that we're giving to the API. First one is the API key. You got to go to openstates.org and register an account to have a key to interact with the API. Second one is parameters versus URL arguments versus headers. These are just different components of the requests that we make to the API. Not going to go into all the details of what goes into an HTTP API, but the important thing to know for our API is that headers is the best place for your API key. By convention, that's the name of the header that we're looking for. Params are where most of the filtering happens, although occasionally you get an example like jurisdiction detail where we include a parameter as part of the URL, right? We're addressing North Dakota by adding that into the URL. So that's an important thing to keep track of. Am I using a parameter, a URL argument, or a header to communicate a piece of data to the API? We also learned about jurisdictions. It's important to understand that each jurisdiction is distinct, that it has a set of legislative sessions. The jurisdiction can be identified by ID, name, or in some cases, the abbreviation. Each legislative session has a unique identifier that's unique to that jurisdiction only. So you might get weird results if you're searching by a legislative session identifier that's reused across jurisdictions. So that's why I used both the jurisdiction and the legislative session identifier to filter just into that jurisdiction, that legislative session. And finally, includes. Includes are your friend. If you're not seeing data you're looking for, check the docs to see if there's an include that can be specified to get the data back that you're expecting. Awesome. Thanks for joining me for this introduction to the API offered by Open States, which gives you access to jurisdictions, people, bills. A lot of this other data comes back to bills. So you can find votes, actions, sponsorships, other bill-related things on the data returned by that bills endpoint, as well as committees and events. Thank you very much. Hope you have fun interacting with the API.